Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a great day so far. I hope you got to attend some of the afternoon sessions as well, especially following up after JP's incredible conversation, and hopefully you'll be able to continue those conversations with other people who are at the conference. So we've got a great session coming up now as well. Really excited for this. I'm going to kick it over to Pat McCabe, who's a senior here at Notre Dame, studying Arabic, Poli-Sci, and Peace Studies as well. So Pat, over to you.
Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to have you here, and it's great to be with our two panelists today. So this is our panel on mediation and reconciliation. We have two great speakers. So we have Sarah Galbenski from the University of Notre Dame, who today will be presenting on Venezuela and her research entitled Conflict Analysis and Strategic Plan and Process for Mediation in Venezuela. And then we also have Elaina Mohr from the University of Waterloo, who will be with us today to discuss her research about Northern Ireland, entitled Living in Spaces of Reconciliation, an Analysis of the Role of Communal Living Space in Reconciliation Processes in Post-Conflict Northern Ireland. So Sarah and Elaina, I'm so excited to get to hear from both of you, and then to have our audience pose some of their questions to you. Sarah, it'd be great to start off with your research, and we look forward to asking you questions. You'll have 15 to 20 minutes.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Patrick. Really appreciate it. I'll ask the host to share my screen at this time, if possible. Oh, fabulous. Okay, can you all see my PowerPoint now? Yes? Patrick and Elaina, can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
We can see it.
Fabulous. Well, I'm so excited to be here with you all today. As Patrick said, I am presenting today a conflict analysis as well as a strategic plan and process for mediation in Venezuela. I'm a senior at the University of Notre Dame, studying Spanish and global affairs with a concentration in international peace studies. And this research formed my senior capstone in international peace studies. So before I dive into the meat of it, I would like to give you all just a brief journey to my research topic. So in the summer of 2018, I participated in an international summer service learning program through Notre Dame Center for Social Concerns in a town called San Jose de Chimbo in Ecuador. This was my first lived encounter with the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis and Venezuelan migrants as well who were living in Ecuador at the time. And just this past fall, the fall of 2020, I took my International Peace Studies senior seminar on international mediation with the incredible professor Lori Nathan. And we were all tasked with selecting a conflict of interest to us and engaging in an analysis of it, with the result being a strategic plan and process for mediation therein. So I'll provide you all with a brief roadmap of my conflict analysis. This will be an analysis of the Venezuelan conflict from Nicolás Maduro's presidential ascendancy, which occurred in 2013, to the present day. I will give a brief disclaimer that this was written in November 2020, so I'll have to have a few caveats since the situation has changed slightly since, but the vast majority of it holds true to this day. I'll begin with a historical overview and the structural causes behind the conflict, and then I'll move to the various issues in dispute, followed by the escalatory, stabilizing, and de-escalatory dynamics. A bit of a spoiler is that almost all of the dynamics are indeed escalatory at the moment, as well as the power dynamics. I will then transition to the various actors' goals, positions, interests, and needs, give a brief review of the past attempts at peacemaking, and look at the ripeness conditions for an intervention of mediation in the present moment. So I really liked this quote from David Smiled, which was part of my literature review. He is actually a visiting professor at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies here at Notre Dame right now. So it was great to have him as an asset and get to dive into his work on Venezuela for this project. And he views the current situation in Venezuela as a clash of power networks, those that are ideological, economic, military, and political, vying for monopoly power. Ideological power networks are defined as the party known as the Chavistas, or the followers of Hugo Chavez, versus the opposition, and the massive disparity in media the Chavistas control the state-run media in Venezuela, and the opposition has virtually no ability to get their message across because of this state media domination. Economically, the country is largely independent on their state oil company, PDVSA, but in the last decade, falling oil prices plus continued high social spending and financial isolation because of the authoritarian regime have led to tremendous hyperinflation in the country. Transitioning to military, the military is heavily involved in Chavista government affairs, and they also benefit from greatly enhanced economic powers. So this is somewhat of a patronage politics relationship that keeps the military loyal to the Chavista government. Politically, the Chavistas have control over all 5 powers of the central government, so an incredible monopoly on power and violence, those being the executive, legislative, judicial, electoral, and even the moral branches of government. So I briefly alluded to Nicolás Maduro, who has been ruling in Venezuela since 2013. And his first 2 years were pretty smooth sailing in terms of his stronghold on power. And the first bona fide challenge to his monopoly on political power came in the 2015 legislative election, in which Juan Guaido, pictured below, his opposition won a supermajority. Maduro was none too pleased with this result. Therefore, he stripped the National Assembly and created his own alternative legislative body. Then Guaido assumed the interim presidency in January 2019 after his democratically elected National Assembly rejected the 2018 presidential election results as illegitimate. So the upshot here is that these two figures had competing claims to both the executive and legislative branches. Maduro did rightly win power in 2013, excuse me, but then he was displeased with the election results of 2015, so formed his own legislative branch, ran again in 2018. That was considered to be illegitimate by almost all countries in the world, as well as election observers. So therefore, Juan Guaido stepped up and had the competing executive power as well. The new twist since writing this capstone is that Maduro reclaimed control of both branches following the December 2020 parliamentary elections, which were also widely considered to be illegitimate by election observers. This takes us to the issues in dispute. I think this is a really stark quote right here that in addition to descending into autocracy and deliberalizing, Venezuela has entered an economic and social crisis that is arguably the worst in the history of the region of Latin America. Hyperinflation going on 2 years in 2018, 2019, a GDP loss of around 65%, a mass exodus of 5 million Venezuelans leading to a refugee crisis. And record high levels of poverty and inequality have created immense human suffering for the Venezuelan people. And so though the Chavistas and the opposition differ regarding the political apparatus and who should be at the helm of it, both sides do agree and have common ground in the sense that this economic and social crisis must be ameliorated. Chavez experienced an oil boom in the early 2000s, but as I said earlier, in the last decade, Maduro has dealt with falling oil prices that are somewhat supplemented with support from China, Cuba, Iran, and Russia, but he is doing nowhere near as well economically as Chavez was, which has led to a grave humanitarian crisis. In the last year, COVID has been an exacerbating factor of this socioeconomic crisis, and it's just a daily reminder of the need for a transition back to democracy in terms of the lack of resources and human suffering that's currently occurring in the country. And finally, an additional factor, an additional issue in dispute is the severe corruption within the National Electoral Council. And it's a widely held opinion that power must be ceded to neutral forces if any future elections are to be considered to be legitimate going forward. We'll transition to the escalatory and power dynamic section of this conflict analysis. And as I said earlier, most everything is currently escalatory, especially in terms of in 2020, the vague threats by former President Trump that an invasion of Venezuela would be considered a way to end the Maduro regime, this rhetoric known as all cards on the table. And this actually really worked in Maduro's favor in the sense that it bolstered this public perception that he wanted to disseminate, that he is, quote unquote, the defender of the Venezuelan people against US imperialism. In terms of power dynamics right now, since January 2019, when Guaido assumed the interim presidency, the opposition had a strategy of pressure and collapse, not only involving Guaido's declaration, but also this April 2019 coup attempt. But this overarching strategy has so far failed, especially in its use of humanitarian aid and the withholding thereof to provoke a split in Venezuela's armed forces, which went against all international humanitarian aid principles, including neutrality, impartiality, independence, humanity, and above all, doing no harm. And since 2019, when Guaido claimed the interim presidency, optimism in his pressure tactics has waned considerably. I draw on some statistics in my paper that he had about 70% support in January 2019, which has waned to about 18% today, which has emboldened Maduro even further. And it makes him less likely to view yet another mediation attempt as advantageous for his regime, which, as I've said, has a complete monopoly on power to this day. And then this quote is going to be the introduction for my section on goals, positions, interests, and needs. This is actually a quote from Professor Laurie Nathan in his UN manual on mediation. And he states that a conflict party's positions are its stated demands, its publicly declared solutions to the problems as it sees them. Whereas a party's interests are the perceived benefits, costs, and threats that motivate it to take certain positions. And finally, and most fundamentally, a party's needs are elemental aspirations and fears that underlie its more public positions and interests. So whereas it can be really irreconcilable for conflict parties to find common ground in terms of positions or even interests, needs is where a mediator can really find common ground between conflict parties and what they fundamentally desire. So to start more broadly with goals and positions, the Chavistas have as their goal the survival of Hugo Chávez's Bolivarian revolution under the command of now Nicolás Maduro, who is Chávez's appointed successor. The opposition, on the other hand, has the installment of a pluralistic form of democracy as their ultimate goal. These overarching goals leads to the positions that Chavistas hold, that Maduro should continue governing despite the fact that he has held on to power by becoming more and more repressive and corrupt. And as I said earlier, winning election in May 2018 in a vote that was boycotted by both the main opposition parties and not recognized by the vast majority of Western countries. On the other hand, the opposition holds the position that due to Maduro's evident manipulation of the legislative branch and illegitimate re-election, he should resign. The original National Assembly's parliamentary functions should be restored, and free and fair elections should be held, ideally by an independent National Electoral Council, in order to democratically elect a president. This leads us to our more fundamental interests and needs. And for the Chavistas, on a fundamental level, the Maduro regime is interested in self-preservation. They know that in today's day and age, an authoritarian regime will not just be allowed to go lightly into the good night, but that there will be a great deal of transitional justice measures applied to them to hold them accountable for their past human rights violations. But a negotiated transition facilitated through mediation may permit Maduro and the members of his regime to lead somewhat more attractive afterlives after their lives in power, relative to ugly falls of grace that could likely occur if the opposition were to usurp them by more forceful means, as have been attempted in the last 2 years. The opposition, on the other hand, underlying that position of pluralistic democracy is legitimacy and respect for democratic institutions, as well as alleviation of the country's humanitarian crisis, and a reactivation of the economy. So I really think this quote succinctly distills their interest, that they will need to recognize that a push for quick transition based on maximum pressure, this pressure and collapse strategy that Guaido has supported, has ultimately failed, and that they need to carry out a process of normalization at this time, given the approval ratings. This would, unfortunately to them, entail an implicit recognition of the Maduro government. However, engaging in this process of normalization could develop social and political capital that could make a negotiated agreement more likely. Finally, and most fundamentally, their needs. Both parties do recognize, which is somewhat of a starting point, that they must work together to address specific practical problems that everyone understands are urgent at this moment, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic, such as providing emergency food, medicine, and other basic necessities as a critical confidence building measure. Finally, we'll transition to ripeness conditions at this current moment. And as I've said, the opposition and approval ratings are greatly falling, and they were dealt quite a blow in the December 2020 parliamentary elections. So since the government currently perceives itself to be in a position of relative power, it doesn't consider this current stalemate that they're in to be mutually hurting. From their perspective, while the opposition may be flailing, they have stood firm amidst all of the increased pressure that they've been dealt in the last 2 years specifically. However, I would argue that a lack of ripeness at the present moment is no excuse for international mediators to simply sit on their hands, but rather it's an invitation for mediators to take proactive steps to ripen the conflict for mediation in the future. So therefore, every strategy suggested in my mediation plan upcoming will constitute a ripening measure at this point in time. So before we get into the mediation plan, I just want to briefly provide a synopsis of mediation attempts that have occurred in the last 5 years, 4 of which have all ultimately been unsuccessful. The first was led by UNASUR and the Holy See, and their representatives essentially acted as accompaniment figures who encouraged the process, but without any substantial intervention. And as you can see, these two conflict parties are very combative and very much need substantial intervention and not just accompaniment throughout the process. So then in 2016, the Holy See took over mediation alone, and we saw significantly more robust engagement on the part of the Holy See. However, they still did not call themselves mediators. They thought that would turn the conflict parties off. They claimed they were merely facilitators, but they did actively make suggestions, pushed for agreements, and actually brokered a deal, which fell apart within a week, but a deal was brokered, which was a step in the right direction. The two most recent mediation attempts, the first being 2017-2018 in the Dominican Republic, put forth a well-developed proposal provided by the mediators, and that's the key here, that it was provided by the mediators and not the conflict parties themselves, that did have a concrete discussion of the issues. However, the two sides at least agreed on what the issues were, but they remained far apart in how to address them. So again, this was more of a discussion and a presentation of the issues instead of a concrete plan about how to mitigate them and address them going forward. The most recent mediation attempt, and arguably the most successful, was facilitated by the International Contact Group as well as the Norwegians. And the peacemaking experts from the Norwegian side structured the process in 5 phases, which were exploratory talks, agenda setting, negotiation, agreements, and monitoring the agreement. So by far the most structured process thus far. And by most accounts, the parties advanced into the 3rd phase over nearly 3 months, but that still leaves a lot of room for ensuing negotiation, agreements, and subsequent monitoring, which I will propose. So I propose the following mediation mandate and objectives in my paper. The first and most fundamental being the humanitarian crisis that must be ameliorated for not only diplomatic, but also international normative reasons. And again, David Smiled provides a succinct analysis by saying, Alleviating the widespread misery affecting most Venezuelans is vital, not only on humanitarian grounds, but also to provide space for the negotiating process and to begin developing public support for the possibility of a negotiated solution. And this kind of goes back to something along the lines of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that if there is not adequate food and medicine being delivered to the country, there is no room for self-actualization and mediation. So the humanitarian crisis is the most fundamental mandate of the mediation. Secondly, as a critical confidence-building measure, the mediators must secure the government's release of political prisoners, as well as an end to the persecution of opposition politicians. A mediation effort cannot occur if the vast majority of the conflict party is currently imprisoned, and if not imprisoned, severely persecuted and not able to speak out. So they must be released, and they must be on at least even playing fields for negotiation even to occur. Thirdly, which has never been achieved thus far, but I think is crucial to a democratic transition going forward, is that both conflict parties must be convinced to enact reforms within the National Electoral Council in order to ensure free and fair elections. If the election results are not legitimated, there will never be a thriving democracy. And in order for this to occur, there must be an establishment of an interim pre-electoral administration in advance of a new presidential election that is not biased nor corrupt to one side or another. So as you'll see later, I'll propose a power sharing agreement in this interim pre-electoral administration, but that is the final step of the mediation mandate. Finally, I'd like to just provide a most desirable and most acceptable second best outcome of mediation before we get into the actual strategies. In my mind, the most desirable outcome of this mediation would be the successful implementation of free and fair parliamentary elections held under a new National Electoral Council and the installment of an interim pre-electoral administration in advance of a new presidential election. So this would be taking away the power struggle in both legislative and executive branches and having the people decide in a truly democratic fashion. The second best outcome, if this could not occur, if the opposition is unwilling to concede to the interim vice presidential nomination to Maduro, and the government, on the other hand, is unwilling to reform the National Electoral Council, the most acceptable or second best outcome of mediation would be, at a fundamental level, the establishment of a negative peace, meaning the absence of tension rather than the presence of justice, through the joint distribution of humanitarian aid by both the regime and the opposition as a critical confidence-building measure, and at the bare minimum, a release of political prisoners. So I'll present a few obstacles to achieving these objectives. And in regard to the Maduro regime, the most fundamental objective is simply to secure a party mandate from them. And a huge obstacle to that is that Maduro must be convinced that he'll derive more benefit from taking a chance and participating in a mediation process than he would if he were just to maintain the status quo, which is going pretty well for him at the moment. So at the present moment, he sees little reason to participate due to the organizational incoherence on the part of the opposition, their dwindling approval ratings, as well as at this point, his proven ability to weather threats to his regime over the course of 6 years. On the other hand, in regard to the opposition, they recognize that they only have things to gain from participation in the mediation process at this point. Their most fundamental obstacle is simply providing a coherent front and identifying a valid spokesperson. The opposition has become so fragmented at this point that in order for them to engage effectively in the mediation process, they have to at least be on the same page in terms of what they're looking for from an interim government. So 2 general strategies that I would recommend using to achieve the mediation objectives are, 1, confidence building measures. And this breakdown right here is actually provided from Francisco Diaz, who is a current UN mediator from Argentina that Professor Lori Nathan was kind enough to put me in contact with. And he stated that confidence building measures must be applied on 4 major grounds. The first being confidence in the mediator on behalf of each of the conflict parties that they will follow through. 2, confidence in the general process itself. 3, being confidence within each parties regarding their decision-making apparatus, which goes back to what I was saying about the need for coherent opposition, and 4 being the minimum confidence required between the conflict parties in order to come to an agreement between themselves. I would also argue from my review of the literature that civil society inclusion is paramount to a successful mediation attempt. And I would propose the implementation of a parallel civil society forum in which social leaders who are close to either one of the conflict parties could engage with one another in a space complementary to the political forum, and voice their concerns in a way that is normally not heard in a political forum that's just dealing with top-level government officials or top-level opposition leaders from the major political parties. And now I'll finally transition into specific strategies to achieve each of the 4 mediation objectives that I laid out. Objective 1, of course, being the amelioration of the humanitarian crisis. And I argue that the primary strategy that mediators should employ falls under the category of inducements. So once the opposition and the Maduro regime agree to join forces, this is really their only common ground at this point, to provide emergency food, medicine, and other basic necessities to Venezuelan citizens. The mediating body can induce that, and they should also pledge to provide additional attention and resources, ideally through the EU's Directorate General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations, the EU following from Norway's mediation. Objective 2, whereas the prior strategy constituted an inducement, the strategy that mediators should employ in relation to Objective 2 falls under the category of pressure alleviation. At this moment in time, being a pariah in the international community, the Maduro regime is keenly interested in sanctions relief, and they're unlikely to take decisive action that the opposition would acknowledge and respond to if they don't receive some sort of alleviation and pressure from the mediating body. So I suggest in this case that the EU work with the US government to push for phased sanctions relief in the form of general licenses allowing certain sectors to be exempt, and to minimize the humanitarian toll of economic sanctions, making sure as much as possible that it's targeted at the corrupt government actors rather than the population as a whole. Finally, in Objective 3 and 4, I argue that as an incentive for the government to compromise regarding fair conditions for future elections, the opposition could agree to match progress on these steps. For example, it could meet moves towards an acceptable electoral council by demanding the release of state funds frozen in foreign bank accounts, or authorizing via a vote in Guaido's National Assembly acquisition of loans to buy machinery to restore the country's ailing electricity generation system or any other essential infrastructure. Finally, in Objective 4, well, the mediation mandate does require that Maduro resign 1 to 4 months before the election. His appointment of the vice president, who would ultimately lead the interim pre-electoral administration, is a clear compromise between the two parties and an inducement for them to move forward. And additionally, I think it's paramount that the mediator clearly convey that both Maduro and Guaido are more than free to run in the presidential election, as long as it is, of course, free and fair and internationally observed. So ultimately, my conclusion is that even amid Venezuela's catastrophic contest for power, a route to a compromise solution remains possible. It will require flexibility on the part of both sides, as well as on Washington's, to take it. A negotiated settlement will be impossible without serious compromise by both conflict parties, but there is no other alternative in existence right now, at least, that has the potential to not only restore a negative peace to Venezuelan society, but to also build a more structurally just country. So that's all I have for today, but more than happy to answer any questions that you may have at this time.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. That was a really insightful and thoughtful proposal that you put forward. I really appreciated the way in which you walked us through those final objectives. I'm really grounded in the theory. I look forward to bringing forward any questions that the audience might have. If we move forward to Elaina's presentation, hopefully we can bring the Q&A together and kind of work with some of these questions that might come into conversation with both of of the conversations. So if anyone would like to send their questions into the private chat now, we'll happily bring those forward at the end. But next, we're going to move to Elaina's presentation on Northern Ireland, and take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Sarah, that was incredible and super informative. I just want to thank you so much for all of your research and for sharing that. My name's Elaina. As you've heard, I am in my final year of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And I will be presenting on Living in Spaces of Reconciliation. This was my final capstone research project for my undergrad. So I have a question. What do washing dishes and reconciliation have to do with each other? I had this question in mind after I volunteered at Corrymeela, which is a faith-based reconciliation center just outside of Ballycastle, Northern Ireland. My time in Northern Ireland was cut short due to COVID, unfortunately, but those questions stuck with me. So I pursued some answers for my final year research paper of my undergraduate degree. I'll first explain Northern Ireland as the geographical context of my research, then talk about Corrymeela and how I used it as a case study. Next, I will explain my methodology before discussing my research. So here we go. I used Northern Ireland as the context of a post-conflict society. For a very, very brief history, in the mid-1900s, conflict and violence in Northern Ireland began to increase along political, cultural, and religious lines and marked a time known as the Troubles that you may know. Paramilitary and military violence such as bombings, shootings, raids, fires, and violent protests impacted Northern Ireland throughout this time. Finally, in 1998, a peace agreement, also known as the Good Friday Agreement, was signed. Many organizations have run conflict resolution programs as part of a larger national reconciliation process. However, as a post-conflict society, remnants of segregation between groups still exist in Northern Ireland in community spaces, educational spaces, and of course, religious spaces. I saw how this meant that groups on either side of the conflict could go about their daily lives in isolation from one another. People from both sides needed to wake up, get ready for the day, run errands, work, and complete chores, but never shared these daily rhythms with people from the other group. I wanted to know how daily rhythms fit into reconciliation processes, what impact sharing them would have in reconciling divided groups, and what role the physical space played where these daily rhythms were shared. So I began to look at Corrymeela. Corrymeela is a faith-based reconciliation center founded in 1965 and has a vision to transform division through human encounter. Corrymeela specifically looks to reconcile Catholic and Protestant communities after the Troubles. That was their work post-1998, but now they welcome groups internationally and they have such a large volunteer program. People come from all over the world to be a part of what they're doing. While I was studying school for a semester, I got the chance for one weekend to go and volunteer, which is how I am connected. Corrymeela offers programs such as dialogue circles, conflict transformation workshops, and seminars. But they're more than just a specific reconciliation center. They host school trips, family camps, and they engage in storytelling, play-based learning, and creating art. What stood out to me about Corrymeela is their deep connection to the local context. The organization was started by Ray Davey, a Presbyterian minister from Belfast, and a number of students from Queen's University, which is also in Belfast. The organization has been an integral part of interfaith dialogue and service work since before the height of the Troubles and throughout the Troubles in Northern Ireland, giving them a deep and intimate understanding of the local context of the conflict. And when I say local, I don't necessarily mean just Ballycastle. I mean an understanding of the Northern Ireland conflict from an insider perspective. While participants are at Corrymeela, they have historically lived together in accommodations on the property and intentionally shared daily rhythms such as eating together, walking together, working together, and even washing dishes together. I recognize these practices in my research as communal living. Now, because part of my research is focused on physical spaces, I wanted to bring you into the space of Corrymeela with me. I wish I could show you more pictures, but I don't think it quite does justice to what it feels like to be there. So I will show you one more picture, but I also invite you for just a moment to close your eyes. I'm going to read a description of Corrymeela in hopes that we can enter into this space together. Corrymeela is a large white building which stands near the edge of a cliff top on the north coast of Ireland. It overlooks a scene of incomparable beauty, with the waves far below breaking onto the rocky strand, and beyond that the sea stretches away to the shores of Scotland and the far north. On a hot summer's day, with the sun glinting off the sea and the smell of wildflowers in the fields beyond the house, Corrymeela is a haven of beauty and peace. It is almost inconceivable that Corrymeela is only 55 miles from Belfast and the scenes of some of the bitterest fighting in Europe since World War II. That is from a book called Corrymeela, The Search for Peace by Alf McCreary. And reading that in my research brought me into that space once again of being at Corrymeela, and it felt really important when you're looking at those physical spaces to be able to feel like you were there as well. So keep that in the back of your mind as I go forward. And now I will explain my research. I examined the relevant literature on conflict resolution and intergroup contact, the role of physical space in reconciliation processes, and the phenomenon of communal living. From the body of research I gathered, I chose 3 critical theories, one from each field, to create a framework for my analysis. From the field of research on conflict resolution and intergroup contact, I used a model created by researchers Mohr, Brown, and Prentice called the Theoretical Model of Reconciliation Orientation. This model analyzes factors such as forgiveness and subjective evaluation of past violence that influences an in-group's orientation towards reconciliation with the out-group. From the field of research on physical space and reconciliation, I used the theory of peace spaces from researcher Berthe Vogel. This theory examines the role of neutral spaces where marginalized voices of peace in a society of conflict can evolve, flourish, and challenge discourses of nationalism and violence. Often these spaces are physically removed from where the conflict has taken place so that it can be neutral and it is safe. Lastly, from the field of research on the phenomenon of communal living, I used Barry Shanker's twofold theory explained in his book on intentional communities. The theory looks at alienation and how people identify with their physical and social environment, and ideology, which examines how people relate practically and cosmologically to their intentional communities. Using this framework, as you can see on the screen, I analyzed the role of intentional communal living spaces at Corrymeela, and here is what I found. First, physical space is an important part of reconciliation processes, and it's also woven into the DNA of Corrymeela. As I mentioned, part of my framework includes looking at the theory of peace spaces. Corrymeela states that it hopes to be a home and a safe space to all, and that their vision is to be a place where people from both sides of a conflict can come to meet with no strings attached. And so in this way, I began to understand how Corrymeela did function as a peace space. As participants leave their homes and the norms of division, they also enter into a physical space that is designed for sharing daily rhythms and communal living. The theory of communal living that I talked about shows how members of a community over time begin to attach meaning to the physical spaces they participate in. And the communities start to develop their own style of communication. This communication style identifies members of the community as the in-group, and it also reflects the values that that community holds. So while peace spaces allow members of different groups to meet in a neutral space, when you add in the practice of intentional communal living, you see participants enter into a space where they become members of the same group and participate in reflecting the same values that Corrymeela holds during the time at the center. Which leads me to my next point, looking at identity and identity formation. The theoretical model of reconciliation orientation shows that strong identification with one's in-group can be a factor that inhibits reconciliation programs. but that intergroup contact actually can increase a group's openness to members from the other side. At Corrymeela, groups are able to engage with each other in formal settings, such as the programs they are a part of, but they're also able to connect with each other in more casual settings as they live together for the time they're there. Participants at Corrymeela have reported finding these small moments the most touching as they engage in unexpected conversations and start to realize how similar the experience they carry are to people from the other side of the conflict. The research on intentional community show that over time, an individual comes to include the collective as part of their identity, shifting from an individual identity to a community identity. Similar to what I explained with physical space and the way people attach meaning, participants begin to identify themselves in relation to others not as us and them, but as a larger we. Therefore, Corrymeela demonstrate how important unexpected moments of connection can be, and that engaging with deeper roots of conflict needs to be balanced with connections over more relational things such as sports, hobbies, jobs, and familial roles. Intentional community, therefore, demonstrates how both of these connection points, the formal and informal, fosters a collective identity, and they're both important for reconciliation. Lastly, both reconciliation processes and communal living require agreement and adherence to a set of guiding principles. For reconciliation processes, these principles may look like consenting to participate, respecting one another's contributions, and taking turns when speaking. For communal living, these guiding principles may be similar to house rules, such as equal distribution of work, sharing of resources, and respecting quiet and loud hours. These guiding principles are set up to create an ideal of how communal living will go or how the reconciliation program will proceed. The research shows that as participants are a part of creating and following these principles, there opens up an ability to reimagine a collaborative society. As participants leave Corrymeela and return to their homes, their experiences of participating in these ideologies provides them with tangible and accessible ways to integrate their learning into their daily lives. They can imagine a new ideal of what life could look like in a communal setting, not just at Corrymeela, but back at home as well. That's reimagining those spaces of education, reimagining the community, the way that groups live in different neighborhoods, and reimagining an interfaith dialogue that exists in society. So, what are my takeaways? I found that intentional communal living space made reconciliation processes stronger. Through the creation of a neutral, safe place to foster a collective identity and learn to share in daily rhythms, communal living also makes reconciliation processes more sustainable long-term, as it gives participants the tools and imagination they need to return home and continue those shared daily rhythms in their lives. I suggest that the guiding principles of Corrymeela could serve as a model for reconciliation centers that are being established in other post-conflict societies. These guiding principles include, first, nurturing the individual identity while fostering a collective identity. Second, being intentional with physical spaces and the way they foster sharing daily rhythms. And third, the longevity of a reconciliation center depends on an organization's ability to be flexible and adaptable. Part of this includes having an intimate knowledge of the local context, which is what I discussed about Corrymeela, that they had been there since 1965, and that gave them not only a rich understanding of the context, but also a strong reputation with people that came to know their name. So while Corrymeela may serve as a model with these guiding principles that I've just suggested, different reconciliation centers may look very different, as it depends on the cultural context, it depends on the local context, and also the history of the conflict. Finally, I propose that there are exciting opportunities for further research. As I was looking into conflict resolution, reconciliation, physical space, and intentional communities, I enjoyed diving into each body of literature, but I didn't find a lot of crossover. So, I propose that there's exciting opportunities for further research that might show how washing dishes and reconciliation have everything to do with each other. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Elaina. That was really terrific to hear how you're able to both build on your personal experiences there at Corrymeela and also incorporate what you learned from meeting the different people at the center with your research. Perhaps we'll start with the first question for you. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about, you talked about including the collective and identity and coming up with that community identity. And can you tell us a little bit more about how people at Corrymeela hope to transmit this back to their local communities and back to the broader context in life beyond Corrymeela?
Sure. I'm going to have a little spin on that question. This might not be what they mean, but something that I found in my research was that children were really impacted by their time at Corrymeela, and that was a really you saw a lot of change just in the way that sometimes kids, when they have these ideologies, or rather just these cultural norms upon them of like divided groups, they don't have life experience that is associated with those divisions, let's say Catholic or Protestant, but this is just the rhetoric that they've been told. And so when they come to the center for Corrymeela, whether it's for a school trip or they've come as a part of a family week, they don't know who's who. They don't know which kid are from a Catholic family or a Protestant family, and they develop relationships across these lines where those lines don't exist. As I talked about in these peace spaces, it's a neutral space. It's detached from those divisions. So it may not exactly be the answer that this question was looking for, but a lot of times, even in children, that's where that transition can happen from the center back home. You know, they may go back into schools that might be segregated based on religion, but having that experience of, oh wait, that kid is just like me, but they're from a different family, carries through into the way that society can be changed, which is kind of cool. I think if we say kids are the future, that's a pretty neat way to frame it. But that's one way I think that connection point happens.
Great, thank you very much for that answer. And I encourage everyone to be submitting questions at this time for both Elaina and Sarah. Sarah, a question for you. So a lot of your proposals were based in Zartman's theory of conflict ripeness and finding the proper timing to really engage in these mediations. And so my question is that with the many changing factors going on, especially with new American foreign policy during the Biden administration, since so much of your proposal is based in the idea of compromise, do you think that the larger atmosphere right now is one that's encouraging more compromise? And are there large changes to the status quo that's going to encourage this? Or do you think that overall the larger atmosphere around these negotiations are quite similar?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for bringing up ripeness theory as well. I think, as I said earlier, I don't think conflict in Venezuela has ever been ripe for mediation, but that's not an excuse for inaction. And so I think in the months following my submission of this capstone, I think there was one step forward and one step backwards in terms of compromise in the Venezuelan conflict. I think President Biden's election was very promising. And I did incorporate a little bit of that into my capstone as well, hypothetically speaking, in terms of his great knowledge about Latin America, his great respect for the diplomatic corps, the Summit of the Americas, which is coming up this summer, and his interest in fostering inter-American relations again, and just a reduction of combative rhetoric towards Venezuela. So I think that was a step in the proper direction and allows the United States to perhaps participate hand in hand with the EU in a future mediation attempt. I feel like if President Trump had been reelected, that probably wouldn't have been likely, and it likely would have been the EU alone. I think one step backwards in terms of compromise was the December 2020 parliamentary elections and the fact that they were not carried out freely nor fairly, the lack of opposition participation in those elections. But I do think those elections further underscored the need for an unbiased National Electoral Council that could facilitate future elections that are inherently democratic as a confidence building measure going forward. So I think that it ripened and then it took another step back, but that's all right, because I think that critical confidence building measures can still be put in place to ripen the conflict further for mediation.
Thank you for that response there. And one more question for you. This one comes from Nicolás, who's interested in a future process itself. And he asks, what does the choice of mediator reveal about the conflict itself? What does the shift to mediator choice reflect about the conflict?
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, I actually, I struggled with identifying a mediator for this conflict. When you look at case studies in Africa, say, the African Union is a really strong regional, largely unbiased body for conflicts like this. But unfortunately, Venezuela is much of a pariah in the Organization of American States, which would be the equivalent to the AU in Latin America. So that unfortunately is not a possibility because of their exclusion from that organization at this moment in time. So I had to start thinking creatively about what other organization could step up. And as you saw in the review, the most successful one was led by the Norwegians as well as the International Crisis Group. And they decided that the EU could be a great person to pick up where they left off in their final report surrounding that mediation process. And so I agreed with them since they were the ones that were actually there in the moment. And I think that it is interesting in the sense that obviously Venezuela is not part of the EU, but it does give them more of that impartial outsider status, of course, as long as the mediator shows to both conflict parties that they are unbiased and willing to work with both and compromise. I think the EU could be a great partner, but also with the Biden administration, I would hope that the US government would now support those efforts as well.
Thank you. Elaina, the next question comes to you from Connell, who's our resident Northern Ireland voice. And he asks, given the recent revival of direct violent conflict in Northern Ireland in recent days and weeks, how do you see Corrymeela responding to such emergence of frustration between the nationalist and unionist communities?
Great question, Connell. And of course, you know far more about the context than I do, but I think about the ways that Corrymeela has adapted and shifted over the course of its history. It started out as a place for dialogue and also for community outreach. And so as much as it has that center in Ballycastle, it also has stations in Belfast and in different communities. I want to say Derry as well. And so I would also be curious how they respond. I know that in the Troubles, they did a lot of emergency response, and there's something about coming into that place of need that gives an into these lives. So, for example, they functioned as a refugee shelter when there was bombings and fires in Belfast. They housed families at their center. And so what I guess I hope to see is that service, because that brings people, as I talked about, into spaces of safety. It brings them into spaces of hopefully a home, and that can be a place to start. However, I am also curious how they will respond and shift to a continually changing dynamic.
Great, thank you. For one more question also, for you, Elaina, we have the question of, do you think that the we that's formed at Corrymeela and that communal identity could spread beyond the origins, or is it too specific to spread? And I think also with this, you talked about the power of washing dishes together, right? Do people outside Corrymeela also have to have those direct experiences of interaction, or do you think it's possible to spread that identity without having the necessary activities before it?
I think this is an important question because it does bring up a limitation that I maybe, skirted over in the presentation, but is very real to address, is that it is idealistic. And it's, I think a lot of reconciliation processes and peace processes, you can see very real change, but a lot of research that I talked about is idealistic. And so that spreading of the we, I think part of the challenge is that Corrymeela is beautiful because of its distance from the conflict, but that also is its inherent limitation as well, that participating in these processes gives this ideological framework that you can take back, but it is physically and practically disconnected. And so it doesn't look like washing dishes next to someone anymore. It looks like people that have been impacted enough to want to then take initiative into their own communities. And so hopefully Corrymeela not only fosters that but it also fosters leaders and people that are willing to put themselves out there and try to recreate those processes or those experiences or that connection across line in their community. But it's a little idealistic for sure.
Yeah, thank you for that response. And keeping it on the local and grassroots level and bringing it over to you, Sarah. This one comes from Elaina. In your research, did you come across any grassroots political efforts in Venezuelan communities? You talked about the civil society inclusion. How could these groups participate in both mediation and on the political front?
Well, thanks for that question, Elaina. I got a little prep time because I see it in our private chat. But the first organization or group of people really that comes to mind is journalists in Venezuela that are incredibly intrepid and are really at the front lines of trying to speak truth to power. I know I mentioned the large number of political prisoners right now, but there also are a lot of journalists who are currently imprisoned for the work that they have done. And people like that are normally not included in the typical political forums that have the elites, the heads of state, the foreign ministers. And so there was a really interesting article by Tanya Pathenholtz that we read in our mediation seminar talking about parallel processes and how you can bring in civil society groups. And so I think it would be incredible. Of course, they have to be released first, but to have journalists assemble in a group and talk about not only their lived experiences, but events that they've reported on, how they envision the future as well, and have that maybe be led by the same mediator, a different mediator, but have that really inform the process. I think it can get very messy trying to bring those two groups together sometimes when they feel like they're diametrically opposed or that they won't be heard in a political forum. So I think giving journalists a forum of their own could be really powerful to allow them to speak truth to power in that way, to get their voices heard in an alternative forum, but one that is just as important as the official forum and that would ultimately determine the results as well. So journalists come to mind. Of course, there are a lot of other groups as well, like indigenous activists, women's groups, but I think that all of these groups could come together in a parallel forum.
Thank you. Yeah, and I know you mentioned some of that in your presentation as well about having those other levels of dialogue, reaching beyond that elite tier. So real quick, we're going to try giving a little bit of intersectionality a go in this next question, combining a couple of the questions that we've gotten so far. But this is really about the spread of the reconciliation and dialogue model, and especially when it comes to communities like Corrymeela. So Elaina, we have the question from Sarah of whether you see the Corrymeela model as being unique to Northern Ireland, or whether you believe that it could be applied more broadly. And this also fits well with the question from the audience that asked whether the communal living and reconciliation measures might be possible in Venezuela. So Elaina, we'll let you start with that broad case, and then we'd appreciate you speaking on Venezuela, and Sarah, you could definitely jump in with more of your country-specific insights.
That's neat. I like the intersection of questions, which, yeah, gives us lots to unpack. That's very cool. As for whether it's specific to Northern Ireland and how that would work, I see the question from Sarah, thank you, by the way, is in a US, Canada, Northern American context. I'll take it into a Canadian context really quickly, just to kind of highlight what I was talking about that local understanding. In Canada, I would say one of the a conflict or a group division that's kind of at the forefront is Indigenous peoples and the oppression that they have faced in Canada versus settlers and an ongoing neo-colonial system. And when I think about that and how that would look, it makes me want to highlight what I said about the principles may remain the same, but given the local context is going to completely change what it looks like. Because when I think about, what this communal living, reconciliation, center might look like in an Indigenous peoples and settler context, I think of the power dynamics that would evolve and how much learning that needs to happen from settlers and people that have moved to Canada. There's a lot of learning that needs to be done, and a lot of listening and a lot less of the sharing. And there's a lot of sharing and the need to be heard from Indigenous communities that needs to happen. So while those guiding principles, I do think could exist, given the local context, the power dynamics, the history, it would look a lot different, to give a short answer. And I don't know if I could speak for Venezuela, but I'd be interested what Sarah's insights on that are.
Sure, I was just thinking about that connection. And I've never been to the capital city of Venezuela, Caracas, myself. I have a good friend from there, and I studied abroad in Santiago, and I think the cities are very similar in terms of geographical segregation across the city, that you're likely to live near people who think the way you do, that share similar ideologies. You're not likely to have combative neighbors living next door to one another. People like to live in ideological bubbles, as they do, frankly, in the United States as well. And so I think that a model similar to Corrymeela could be very interesting in Venezuela, to get people outside of these kind of self-selected communities that they're currently in, and dialoguing with the opposition, or with their fellow citizens who just happen to have similar or different views about how the country should be led politically. So it's a really interesting thought experiment. I'd be interested in seeing a Corrymeela in a Venezuela setting.
Thank you. And Sarah, we also have a question from Lynn, which points out the fact that there are 5 million Venezuelans who have left the country at this point. And that obviously presents a big challenge when it comes to buy-in in a process and really having this nationwide form of reconciliation in the end. What do you think would be necessary, even if there is a final agreement reached between the Maduro government and the opposition forces, to have broad buy-in in society? We saw in Colombia where their peace deal was ultimately voted down by the voters. What do you think it would take to have that legitimacy, both within Venezuela and then also within the broader migrant community?
Yeah, I will out my mother. I think everyone can see this is Lynn Galbenski. Thanks for the question, Mom. In regards to where most of the 5 million Venezuelans went, mostly to neighboring Colombia as well as Ecuador. As I mentioned, that was my first lived encounter with Venezuelan migrants, as well as Chile, where I studied abroad for a semester. What's been interesting about the migration paths as a result of COVID is that there have been a lot of Venezuelans that have actually returned home, interestingly enough. There's a great podcast on Radio Ambulante, if anyone wants to listen to it, about a man who had migrated to Colombia for a better life, and was working in the informal sector there. But then when the informal sector shut down as a result of the pandemic, you no longer have street vendors, you no longer have a variety of other informal positions, just found it very difficult to survive. Another interesting aspect was that he was not benefiting from the social programs that the Colombian government was providing for its citizens under COVID, like COVID relief packages in the US would be a comparable example, because he wasn't a citizen. And so he actually went back to Venezuela to be around the support of his family. But it's very difficult because, as I said, food, medicine, gasoline, electricity are not what they should be in the country at this time. And so it's kind of a battle between, yes, he's protected under the social system there. Yes, he has this social support network in terms of his family. but the opportunities for upward mobility are not there like they would be in a Colombia, an Ecuador, a Chile. But I think we're at a really interesting inflection point here in terms of, will more people come back? Now that we're healing from COVID a little bit, although Latin America is still really struggling, will there be more mass exodus because of the systemic structural problems in Venezuela, or are things really worsening because of this public health crisis and people will continue to return home, and maybe there will be more appetite for structural changes in Venezuela because their people are once again invested in returning to their homeland? So I think that'll be a very interesting question as we emerge from COVID in the coming year.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And there obviously are so many different layers of complexity to the process that Venezuela is going to need. As one of the final questions for you, Elaina, this one comes from Rona, who asks, do you think the necessity for reconciliation spaces such as Corrymeela in environments which are understood to be peaceful suggest a fragility of peace beneath the surface and on the ground? And I think this is especially relevant in the current context where, we're decades out from the Good Friday Accords, but now we're seeing this resurgence of violence in Northern Ireland. And what do you think it says about the broader context?
In short, yes. I've been doing some research this semester in a class on religion in peace building, and I think especially when religion plays a role in a conflict, it may not be the whole conflict, but it plays a role. And when there's a long, long history of this conflict, I do think that it can be fragile in the way that a specific moment in time, let's take the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, may signify peace, but when those ongoing threads of cultural division and religious division exist, I think not only is conflict has those lines, but peace has those lines as well. And so I think it is an ongoing, reconciliation is not a one-time process. It's an ongoing process. And I would hope that a reconciliation process would provide more stability over time for a greater peace. It's a relational peace. I think it is absolutely super important to have government level peace agreements and ceasefire agreements. I think that's absolutely necessary. But on an individual relational level, I also think that can contribute over time to a stronger peace. And so Corrymeela, I'll speak a little bit to Corrymeela being specifically removed as a peaceful space. I think that just gives a moment to try and build peace where there might have been tensions or fragility underneath previously. But with that said, I do think that it can be fragile, but that just means that it needs to be an ongoing process.
Great. Thank you. So just as a final question for the both of you, and this one comes from Rebecca, who's interested in knowing what personally inspired this passion that you have for your fields of research. And I think we'd also all be interested in knowing where you plan to take this next. How do you see these large projects playing into whatever future interests and plans you may have?
I guess I can go for it. So as I prefaced in my introduction, I was in an international mediation class for my senior capstone. And as a Spanish major, I'm very interested in Latin America, have spent time in both Ecuador and Chile. And in both places, I encountered Venezuelan migrants and realized the severity of the crisis. So it was kind of a natural pick for me in terms of my regional interests to focus on Venezuela. But I just absolutely loved getting to do the deep dive into the country itself, not having lived on the ground experience there. I think it really brought it to life. I developed an even greater sense of empathy for all of the citizens of Venezuela who are currently living there, migrants, and the incredible pain that they've gone through, and has given me even greater interest in hopefully doing something to ameliorate that part of the crisis someday. I definitely hope to work in inter-American relations, the relationship between US and the broader region of Latin America. And I hope that in my future career, I'm able to dialogue with folks from Venezuela to learn more about the situation on the ground, and hope for stability and a democratic transition.
That's neat to hear, Sarah. I'm very excited for what you're going to do in the future. I think I talked a little bit just about, experiences of classes on reconciliation in my undergrad and then studying abroad in Northern Ireland definitely piqued my interest in this topic. But I think something I've taken away from this is a really deep interest in communal living and the role that plays in just peace building processes on, a national, international level, but also just really practically on a communal level. So although I don't have long-term plans, my short-term plan is that I actually will be moving into a bit of an intentional community setting. I'm going to be working with refugees or newcomers to Canada, but living in and working in the same space that's designated to being neighbors with with newcomers, and specifically housemates with newcomers, and thinking that really close connection with them is important. So that's where I'll be next year, and then also just working on whether they need legal aid or educational aid, or just getting used to taking public transit, getting used to going to get groceries. That'll be my work of just walking alongside people in a really relational and communal way. So I'm really interested in that experience. And I think it might send me even further just to wondering what that communal living, which exists very naturally in other cultures, but has been a little bit disconnected from Western cultures. So I'm interested in deep diving into that more. Great question.
Great. Well, thank you, Connell, for sharing the contact information of both of our presenters from today. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. That was really insightful to get to learn so much more from both of our speakers. And it's exciting to hear that you each have long-term plans to really incorporate these areas of expertise and passion into your next steps. This concludes the question and answer segment. If either of you would like to give some concluding thoughts or remarks in these final minutes, I'm sure we'd love to hear what final ideas you might have. But thank you, everyone, for attending today.
I'll just say thank you so much to the PeaceCon team for bringing us all together in this virtual format, very fancy platform. Have enjoyed using it, but really appreciate all of your hard work over the last year to make this conference a reality. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. And you all absolutely crushed it. So happy for you. And for everyone who attended today, obviously we got the competition ongoing at the minute as well. So that is the code for today as well on the Friday sessions as well. So make sure you type that in and get some nice Croc swag if you end up at the top of the leaderboard as well. So this concludes the second day of the Peace Conference as well. I can't believe it's going really fast after working on it for so many months as well. But we start tomorrow at 9:15 a.m. Eastern Time. We've got a session on the influence of involving prefects in arbitration on conflict resolution in public secondary schools in Kenya. And that will be followed by our second keynote of the conference as well. This one's really exciting as well. Bridget Mohr, the CEO of Peace Direct, who will be talking about shifting power for peace, the role of local communities in a new era of global peace building. So thank you so much. Have a great day, and we'll see you all tomorrow.